All right. We'll be back starting in a few more seconds here. Okay, so we're now coming into our third of three sessions for the day. If I can get a couple of thumbs up just to make sure we're getting the video and audio, or sorry, the slides and the audio correctly in the chat. Perfect. Okay, we're good to go. So now we're going to be talking about some of the constraints and actually the mitigation strategies we can take as we address the remaining non-core science challenges remaining between the current state of fusion and fusion as a fully operating energy industry. So just as a little refresher, we talked earlier about a ton of different designs, lots of concepts, lots of approaches, and many different companies operating within those different approaches. So as you might imagine, when we have all these different designs and all of them are proprietary and all of them have incredibly valuable IP that they don't want to make public, it means that there are even more components, services, parts, raw materials that have to go into these different systems, and that each of them require different sets of those inputs in order to develop, operate, and eventually decommission their machines. So as you might imagine, this creates a scenario where it's very difficult for either side to actually build up the full supply chain that we need, and especially to do it at a cost that's effective. So what we're going to talk about now is how we get there in spite of this context and given these type of difficult constraints. But first, I want to set the table and give you guys a bit of a sense of where we're at right now and what are the big remaining scientific challenges and non-scientific challenges that we still need to tackle and that we need to prioritize in order to succeed in delivering a full functioning fusion industry. So first of all, let's take a look at how the US Department of Energy is defining the remaining major scientific challenges. Now, this is across all of the different designs that we discussed. And for that reason, different ones of these may feel more familiar to you, depending on which of those designs you're most familiar with yourself. And also, depending on the design, each of these may be at different levels of maturity in your relevant context. For example, blanket development and testing. This is both the blanket that creates that breeds tritium and deuterium-tritium reactors, and also more broadly, the blanket designs that allow us to capture heat and turn it to begin the process of turning it into electricity. That's something that actually has not been actively tested within reactors yet. And even the modules that are scheduled to be tested eventually in ITER for this specific component have not yet been built, just as one example. Other areas like plasma confinement and performance that we see at the bottom right has been deeply developed and is the core focus of many of the companies that you've learned about today. And then each of these other components and technical inputs falls somewhere between those two within that range. As we look forward though, and especially for this class, because we're talking about the business of fusion, it's really important for us to understand what are the other constraints. If we assume that we can make progress and we can succeed in tackling the scientific challenges related to fusion, what else do we need to start looking forward towards to make sure that when the science is solved, we'll be able to deliver it to market in a way that's cost effective and meaningful. And so we can look at now at two different time periods. First of all, when we ask fusion companies, what are the practical limits that they expect to see as major in blue and minor in orange challenges between now and 2030, you can see that first at the very top of the list is just hitting that Q or increasing Q to a higher level. That's that's the energy return, and we had talked about scientific, Q engineering, and Q economic. It's improving the productivity of their reaction. After that, we can see I've highlighted in green some of the different topics they're also starting to look forward to, even now, that are non-scientific in nature. So things like funding, tritium self-sufficiency, integrated systems engineering, geopolitics, and many more. But overall, there's a positive sentiment in the industry, with only 31% of players saying that they're concerned about that sufficiency. So next, let's look forward after 2030 at what happens. So if you see those same green highlighted areas, they're moving up the list. And these are becoming the primary concerns of the future commercialization of the industry. And part of the reason why is that at 2030 is where we see that inflection point. The companies are starting to talk about expecting to put physical machines on the grid, pumping out electrons into the energy system. Critically here, this is where we start seeing tritium self-sufficiency jump right to the top. Maintenance, waste, recycling, decommissioning, all those operational factors become much more important. And funding, because this step represents a major proof point that de-risks investment in fusion, starts to slip down that list as we see the growth of these other factors. Critically here, we see there's a significant increase in the number of organizations that see a concern about the sufficiency of specialist suppliers in this time frame. So really, when you're thinking about conflicting information you might hear, even what we're going to share with you today, between where there are shortages, where there's abundance, a lot of that has to do with time framing and over what period we're talking about. So we covered a lot there, right? There's 20 or so different items just in the non-scientific. There's the scientific challenges. So when we look at the non-scientific portion, how do you kind of frame that all? Again, this is going to be one of those great examples of me oversimplifying something a little bit to get a key point across and to give you something that you can take away from this session that you'll be able to easily remember as kind of the major points to focus on as you're looking across the industry. And again, depending on what approach you take, these different issues will be slightly, or these different priorities will be slightly different. But these are kind of the highlights that I think are the major phases as we look across the entire industry. So first of all, financing. Sergey's just told us all about this, but there's a huge amount of financing that we just need to get the companies going, to get the companies building the type of systems that will solve the science, that will bring us down the learning curves Layla told us about earlier, and that will help us get to a point where we're even producing electrons at a low cost and putting them on the grid. The second part is, as soon as we've shown that that can be done, there's going to be enormous demand for fusion. And there's going to be funding, there's going to be supply chains. All of those things will grow up once it's shown that that is possible. So immediately, we're going to start having to look into our feedstocks. So we talked about tritium already, but this is not the only feedstock where there's likely to be some challenges as we begin to grow. And I'm going to talk to you guys a little more in detail about that later. The flag about DT is just calling out that when we talk about tritium, that's usually in relation to the deuterium tritium fuel cycle. And there are other equivalent shortages we might face with other designs as well. Going out a little further, starting to look at 2040 type of time frame, this is where we get into really the meat of what Layla was talking to us earlier about with techno-economics and learning curves. And there's a critical cycle that we'll be going through around that point where the initial costs and our ability to build the first few plants in an efficient way, or with a credible path to becoming more efficient from a cost perspective, will drive the amount of demand there is for us to put more fusion power out, creating energy for the grid. And that demand will drive our volume, which will drive our ability to continue to learn and drive those costs further down. We'll look at this in detail more as well, but this is a really critical inflection point for the industry as a whole. And then finally, as the demand starts growing, building fusion plants starts ramping up, now we have to start looking at whether we have enough of the right materials, inputs, components, etc., that are specially needed for fusion power plants, and that are needed to scale up to hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of plants around the world. The one factor that's going to be continuous across this entire period of growth and all of these hurdles is the need for talent. what specific talent we're going to need is going to continue to evolve throughout these periods, but we are always going to need a strong evolution and a significant volume of talent, with some projections saying we're going to need as many as 1 million new jobs working on fusion by 2050. So I hope this is something that you can kind of keep encapsulated in your mind as we go forward. And now I'm going to walk you through in detail what some of these actually look like and what's driving these shortages, as well as how we can tackle them. So I'll be quick here. We just had a big deep dive on financing, but the critical point that we need to get past is really about understanding who are those players and what is that structure that will help us get through that gap, between significant investment from government and universities and getting to a point where there's a well-funded private sector at exactly the point where there's still a significant amount of risk and uncertainty left in that market. So we had some great questions about that, and hopefully you guys feel you have a better of a picture of the direction we can go in that sense. Next, we have our feedstocks. So again, calling out, this is one of those slides that's talking specifically about deuterium, tritium. We're going to go into some other designs in just a moment. But when we do look at those deuterium, tritium designs, not only do we see a challenge related to the limited availability of tritium coming from those CANDU reactors that we talked about earlier, and the fact that it has a limited lifespan, so it's going to diminish over time if it's not being created. But also, even though we assume as a critical foundation of the fusion industry that we will be able to breed tritium through the fusion reaction, even that has its limits. And again, during this part, I'm especially going to call out places where you can actively take action or make use of the insights that we're getting in this class. But here's one of those really key points where there's a critical decision to be made around design for many of these different reactors. And the way that we design and select our different blanket approaches can have a massive impact on how fast we can scale the industry using just that bred tritium that we're generating inside the reactors themselves alone. So you can see there's actually been a study completed projecting what that doubling rate is of how many new reactors can be built using the tritium byproduct or tritium output of existing reactors with tritium breeding capabilities. And the difference is extremely stark. So just showing the difference between a conventional blanket and a liquid immersion blanket, you can see the difference of 10 years to 2 years as a doubling period, which, as you might imagine, makes an enormous order of magnitude difference over the period of a whole industry's evolution. But as I mentioned, these are not the only feedstocks. Even for deuterium, tritium, the way that we breed that tritium involves actually interacting with both lithium and a mineral called beryllium in order to release the tritium that we want to create. What's critical about that is that for fusion, we create that reaction using an isotope of lithium called lithium-6. Now, out in nature, only about 8% of the lithium in the world is lithium-6. The rest is lithium-7, which is very valuable for nuclear. In its natural mix, it's already useful for batteries. But for fusion, at least the convention has been that we will need mostly lithium-6. And if we design reactors that require only lithium-6, the amount we have available is just not going to be sufficient to build and run the reactors that we want to have. However, there is a lot of research indicating that we may be able to create designs which rely on a much closer to natural occurrence ratio between the lithium-6 and the lithium-7 being used in the reactors. And the closer we can get to that ratio, the more likely it is that we can be completely sufficient with lithium production for the fusion industry. Looking at other fuels, helium-3 is one of the other fuel choices that we've looked at. And here as well, we can see there may be meaningful shortages if we can't produce this in the flow of producing fusion power. Right now, there's less than 50 kilograms produced per year around the world. And some projections are as high as 50,000 kilograms needing to be consumed per year for fusion reactors. Now, I do want to make a huge disclaimer here. This is data produced by one of those companies we talked about that's trying to propose mining helium-3 from the moon. So they obviously have a strong bias, and this is not peer reviewed. But I do want to say, even at an order of magnitude of 1/10 of what we're seeing here, this would still be a critical challenge that needs to be planned for and strategized as we build towards a more functioning operating fusion industry. Okay. This is that cycle that I was talking about, and you can see actually on the right the models that were produced in the study that Layla participated in and contributed to with MITEI, where you can see that depending on the price that's able to be achieved for fusion power, there's a dramatic difference in its deployment on the grid. Essentially, as we have more plants or more demand, we build more plants. The more plants we build, the more learning opportunities we have. As we learn to produce more efficiently, so that cost goes down per plant. And then that drives more demand because essentially electricity is the commodity of all commodities, and price really is that primary driver. So you can see that not only is there an enormous opportunity if we can find ways to make the price lower, but also, and this is partly because of the different types of end markets there are available for fusion, there almost definitely will be at least some place for fusion within the global market, even at some of the higher prices being projected. And I think this is a critical part as well for some of the questions we were getting around, how can we make this much investment while there's so much uncertainty in the market? Yes, there's uncertainty about which design. There's uncertainty about the price. There's uncertainty about exactly what end uses it will be used for. But it is extremely likely that there will be at least some meaningful deployment of fusion on the global energy grid. And I think this is something that we can also factor into the way that we're thinking about that investment and financial capacity as well. Now, assuming that we get that cycle running, we have the flywheel going, and we're building fusion plants, many per year, hundreds per year across the world. Amazing. But now we have to start thinking about how do we get all the materials that we need in order to actually build the components for those plants. So here I'm showing an example of just the materials that go into one particular design of a deuterium tritium magnetic confinement fusion power plant. And even there, you can see that there are many, many different materials, some of which you may never have actually heard of before, and many of which are very specific to fusion. So there's not necessarily going to be an enormous supply chain or mining path set up in order to support the needs of the global fusion industry for those minerals. But let's take a look at what that might look like. Now, again, we're looking at what might happen if we were to deploy the entire energy grid demands worth out of a single design, and that design were a deuterium tritium magnetic confinement plant that used a lithium beryllium blanket, et cetera, et cetera. However, as I walk you through this, you'll recognize the key point here is that there is critical reason for us to look forward, not just at what materials we're using now and their implications on things like decommissioning and nuclear waste, but also to think forward to how much of them are available, how abundant they are on Earth, and how able we will be to continue extracting enough volume of them to build these plants. So there are three different categories that we may experience a shortage in when it comes to the materials required for fusion. First of these are materials and minerals that would be consumed completely just by their need within fusion alone. So we can see beryllium is a great example of that, where potentially all the beryllium that exists on Earth, not what's being mined or what's economically feasible, all the beryllium we're even aware of could be fully consumed in 40 years by the deployment of fusion if we're successful and it grows rapidly. In other examples, like copper or nickel, there are still shortages where, but those shortages are driven by demand from the larger energy industry transition towards greener and more carbon-free power sources and the deployment of more energy grid. In these scenarios, even though that it causes a threat to fusion, I'll walk you through it in a little bit. This actually opens a big door of opportunity for how we can address these challenges. And then lastly, there are some shortages where even though the total volume on Earth is sufficient of that raw mineral, there are also constraints about how fast we can mine them and what our rate of production and refinement can be. So with all that in mind, I don't want to leave you depressed or hopeless about fusion. I want to actually share that, part of the reason I'm pointing these out is even with all of these challenges, there are an incredible array of potential solutions that we can deploy in order to address these different challenges that we're facing. So when we look at these supply limitations and critical minerals, et cetera, what are some of the solutions that are on the table? First of all, we have material strategy. So right up at the design level, my thesis that I wrote was on the critical mineral sufficiency for fusion. And even without a deep, plasma physics understanding and expertise, I was able to look across the wide range of incredible designs, materials, and approaches that people are taking towards creating operating fusion plants. And you could actually very easily Frankenstein together components, materials, and designs from different parts to create a machine that would include all the relevant components made up of materials that would not cause constraints or run into these types of limitations as that scaling continues to grow. So while this is not a scientific solution, it just points out how much opportunity there is to learn across the industry and share expertise, share development in order to reach more and more opportunities. The second one, I touched on a little bit earlier, but by getting the right isotope mix of lithium, we will be able to reduce the constraints that might be faced with that mineral. And there are similar constraints that are relevant to other materials as well. So it's really important that we think that we continue to conduct research in this area, as there are lots of pieces of research coming out about both isotope split and usage within fusion, like lithium, but also isotope production and how to create things like tritium in a more efficient way. Next, in all those scenarios where we actually have a huge demand from the larger market and the demand from fusion is more getting squeezed out by how much of those minerals are being used in other places, fortunately, there are many of the materials that we need that are shelf stable, physically quite small, and used in minimal abundance within the fusion reactor, even though they're critical. Some of them are just components that are added to alloys used in the larger reactor. And in many of these scenarios, you can stockpile everything you would need to build a reactor, potentially in a 1 meter by 1 meter cube that would cost you $100,000 or so. And this was a measurement I was able to conduct on several of the minerals actually required for fusion. So we can plan ahead in ways that assure we have the right access, since the volumes we need for fusion are so small for certain materials. Next is really interesting as well. There's a huge underutilization of recycling as a solution for getting access to these critical minerals that we need. And most importantly, I'm going to share a little with you later about how big a role geopolitics plays in our access to the different components at all layers of the supply chain, from mining all the way through to subsystems. But this is a place where almost any player in the global market can have a chance to engage. Right now, when we look at only what can be extracted from the earth, if your country just doesn't have resources of rare earths, for example, you have nothing to extract. But almost every country has an enormous amount of electronic waste these days, which provides us with a huge quantity of the materials we actually want for these purposes, if only we can develop the recycling systems to make better use of what's already there. Lastly, there's a huge opportunity for advancing technology to actually just increase the total availability of cost-effective access to critical minerals and other inputs through new technologies such as cobalt metals, which uses AI to identify locations never before identified for sources of raw materials. And finally, policy and regulatory engagement can have a huge impact on this through improving international trade and, again, addressing those geopolitical challenges in a more head-on way. Because what we can see, especially from the way that players like Japan, Canada, and the UK, and even the UK, medium and smaller countries that want to be deeply engaged in fusion, are often participating most heavily as a supply chain player uniquely, and they can still engage because they've engaged in the right policy and regulation to increase their global trade with these partners. So, as you can see, with this wide array of designs, wide array of approaches, there are many opportunities across this market to address the challenges that we're facing. But critically, they still depend, like I was saying, on us having the right relationships geopolitically. So we won't go as deep on this area because it really does depend a lot more on political leadership and direction. However, it's really important to understand that even though there's more than enough of many of the supplies and inputs that we need to go around, especially if we're creative and forward thinking with our designs, we can still put ourselves in a place of challenge when we think at an individual country level, because that abundance is a global abundance, not an evenly distributed abundance with access in every single place. So you can see, for example, Brazil represents over 90% of the world's niobium total resources and their annual production. So fortunately, Brazil is a very open trading country. It has good relationships with many Western countries that might want to be involved in fusion. But it is important to be aware of that concentration, especially when you look at other examples. Like at the bottom, we see 5 of the top 10 minerals that we need, where China is the largest country of annual production. Now, with that in mind, I hope I've given you a good picture of the supply chain risks when it comes to minerals. But now let's step back and look more systemically at the whole supply chain and how it actually evolves as a whole. Essentially, we have this chicken and egg problem where supply chain companies need to invest in the technology to actually build capacity. For example, maybe right now, a particular company can build 1 linear foot of magnetic tape for a superconducting magnet per day. If we want them to be able to manufacture a kilometer of that per day, they need to invest in machines, talent, etc. But in order to make those investments, they either need lenders or they need partnerships and future purchase commitments from the actual end machine builders, fusion machine builders, who are going to buy that product from them. At the same time, the fusion machine builders are dependent on the availability of that supply to be certain that they will be able to actually deliver on what they need. So it creates a challenge. In more detail, we can see that this is compounded by the specific nature of the way that that this supply chain operates and the demands of the fusion industry. So first of all, many of the supplies and inputs that are required for fusion are only required for fusion. And what that means is that even though there are several different fusion players, they all have a common axis of success or failure, which is the progress and success of fusion as a concept, driving whether they will be a customer or not for these supply chain companies in the next 10 or 15 years. So that makes them a functional monopsony, even though there are many, many different players. On top of that, we compound that with the fact that there's unique IP in each of these different companies, and they don't have an interest in aligning a single approach across the entire market. Partly, that's incredibly healthy. We want that because of all the reasons I was just saying, and the doors that it opens for us to have a ton of different approaches and innovation happening in the space. At the same time, it makes it even harder for supply chains to provide cost-efficient inputs to these machines that will allow the fusion machine companies to project really aggressive techno-economic analysis-based learning curves and cost rates that will get them in the investment they need in order to build out, because those supply chain companies need to provide more tailored, customized services, so they lack the opportunity to get the economies of scale as well. Finally, those needs of the fusion industry being so specific also mean that those suppliers rarely can sell to outside markets. So all of this comes together, and you get, what I'm referring to as the unique IP problem, but essentially it requires standardization, alignment, and risk sharing in a way that actually doesn't serve the current progression of the market. And this is where we get stuck. So you can see that this is a strain that's really being felt by supply chain players. You can see the statistics on the right. Many of these players are ready, they're willing, they're eager to start scaling up production, but they just need a little more partnership of someone else buying in to defray the risk a little. And those other players are dealing with their own challenges around the risk that they can absorb as well. So the whole industry does have to move forward together. Next, we're going to talk about that talent gap that we were talking about earlier. For a lot of people, this is maybe one of the most interesting parts of the topic, because this is the story of how you can become part of the fusion industry as well. First of all, just to give you a little bit of context, today 75% of fusion workers are scientists or engineers, and 38% of those of them in total are PhDs. So when you think about what kind of company can run on almost 40% PhDs, it is a very innovation, academia focused type of business. It's not necessarily a business that's optimized for things like cost, things like revenue, things like partnerships and grid deployment, as well as operation. And this is exactly why earlier in the conversation, I wanted to make sure to call out to you how those metrics and KPIs are so different across the types of players that we're going to need to carry this technology to market. So what does it look like? Over the next 10 to 15 years, we're seeing projections of up to 1 million new jobs being required for fusion. And you can see here in the blue at the top, a big majority of those jobs are going to come from supply chain. But where? Right? So let's pause first and just note that while we are going to be shifting away from being entirely scientific as an industry, there still will be a significant amount of space for technology players and scientists, with a prediction of up to over 18,000 jobs being created just within the fusion power plant companies themselves. However, like I said, there's a much bigger opportunity and growth in supply chains. So when you look at reports like the Fusion Industry Association report, why are we seeing that supply chain companies are not concerned about the availability of talent? Well, essentially it's because there are two major categories of skill set that are going to play into this market. There's STEM skills and trades, but almost all of them relate to either furthering the core development of the design or the actual deployment of the plants, rather than the ongoing supply chain cycle that's required as the industry reaches operation. So just to call a few of these out, it's the electrical and mechanical engineers who will actually set up the plants themselves. It's the materials scientists that will start at the other end of the chain, helping make sure that this technology even gets realized. And then down on the skilled trades level, we're looking at material extraction and refining. People who can smelt steel is one of the most cited potential gaps in terms of skills within the industry. So you can see there's a wide range of these, but one of the ones that you may not be as aware of, and really the only one that focuses almost entirely on operational power plants, is AI and data science. So there has recently started to be a significant growth in models, both operating as digital twins of power plants to help optimize them and continuously improve them, and also operational models that help manage things like plasma flow in real time as these plants continue to operate. So our last point, as came up in our conversation with Dan Brenner, is the public engagement. The key highlight here is really that, as much as we've learned today about the differences between fission and fusion, the strongest sentiment we can see here is that fusion, people feel a little better about fusion than about fission, but almost everybody feels neutral or doesn't have a strong opinion about where it fits. So there's a huge opportunity in that, first of all, that we can educate people and bring them further along the curve with information like what you learned today. But more importantly, that there's not as strong of a negative sentiment that we have to overcome to get there. And that is a huge opportunity as we move forward with this as an industry. So I'll stop there for our topic on supply chain, but please let me know if you have any questions or hop into the chat.